Okay, so to start officially now, thank you everyone for coming. We are starting one of the last sessions on this conference named Transhuman Multiverse. I would first of all like to thank our speakers. I would like to thank all of you in the audience for sticking with us until the third day. Our first speaker is Marius Markutskas, with the title of his lecture, Historical Ontology as a Tool for the Critique of the Transhumanist Educational Paradigm. Marius?
So, hello everyone. First of all, I would like to say that it is a real honor to be here with you and to listen to all of your truly excellent and inspiring presentations. And of course, at the same time, I'm very happy to be able to share my own ideas with you as well. The title of my presentation is already mentioned, unless additionally I should say that the critique of the transhumanist educational paradigm also is a critique of transhumanism as an ideology and project. Perhaps I used the word educational in the title because I really wanted to be accepted here at this conference. And I'm not an expert on education, as many of you are. I represent a field of philosophy, and first of all, I'm interested in transhumanism, but not education. Quite recently, I defended my PhD thesis on transhumanism at Vilnius University. But if to be more seriously, I really think that to use the terms I have in mind, transhumanist educational paradigm and transhumanism synonymously, as I do in this presentation, is relevant. Of course, you will assess it as if it is really is. Yeah. To save time, I will not elaborate more precisely on the title. I hope my speech will reveal more about it in due course. However, since the first word of the title refers to history, I take the liberty of starting with a short story. In my opinion, this story can be linked to the broader history of the critique of the phenomenon of education. Criticism of the phenomenon of education is not new, and I had an opportunity to see this recently. At an antiquarian bookseller in Vilnius, Lithuania, I bought Louis Bertrand's book on the life of Saint Augustine. Book is titled Saint Augustine as well. And this book was published at the beginning of the 20th century and was highly acclaimed at the time. I do not know much about Saint Augustine's biography. However, there was one topic in this actually well-written book which really interested me, perhaps because I knew that I'd be attending this conference. As all of us here probably know, the life of Saint Augustine was full of human passion, and at some points in his life he didn't resemble a saint at all. Right from primary school in Tagaste, the town where Augustine was born, he had issues with obedience, with some of the academic subjects, and more generally we could say with the education system itself. As a boy, Augustine simply hated school. Bertrand wrote that a child with an intuitive spirit and agile temperament could not adapt to its methodological ossification. Also, Augustine didn't like that teacher used to beat him, just like other children. Of course, who would like that? Monica, Augustine's mother, just scoffed at her son who was complaining about school and the education process in general. What did Augustine do? According to Bertrand, even as a child, when he realized that he would have no earthly support, he began to turn his eyes up heavenwards and look to God for salvation. I know that both humanists and transhumanists like to talk about human perfection very much. So let me make a little joke here. Who knows, maybe it was the imperfect education system of the time that gave the world one of the greatest philosophers, a genius mind of humanity, a perfect, at least from the perspective of a certain historical and cultural epoch, human, a saint. On the other hand, one could ask more seriously, has there ever been such a thing as a perfect education system, or if to put it in a more general way, perfect education? It is true that the ideal of the perfect human existed, and despite all of the postmodern tendencies, including cultural posthumanism, still exist. Ideals have varied in different historical and cultural epochs, at one time embodied by a theoretical philosopher, at other times by a saint such as Augustine, and at others in the present day by a scientist, expert, or just a person who grounds their existence on scientific knowledge, as we say, an educated man. There is no doubt that is the epoch that, if not the genesis, then allowed what can be called educational consciousness to flourish. Or, to put it in other words, it allowed for the flourishing of the idea that a human, imperfect in many ways, can be transformed or molded. Let me remind you that in Latin, the word education holds the specific connotation to mold, to mold as well. So, human, imperfect in many ways, can be transformed or molded through scientific knowledge and technological means into a better or even perfect entity. The Enlightenment, more than other historical and cultural epoch, established the idea that the old natural limited human could be transcended to create a new human, or even a new kind of being altogether. For example, Julian Alfred de la Mettrie already wrote that we are just evolving butterflies, so according to La Mettrie, we should certainly not dismiss the idea of the possibility of turning humans into immortal machines. And that is why there is indeed a case, as many transhumanist scholars do, and as I am inclined to do as well, for treating the paradigm of Enlightenment thought, which in its essence is educational, or seeking to transform the individual altogether, not only as humanist, but also as transhumanist. Both Renaissance, Enlightenment, humanism, and transhumanism believe in the power of science to impact and radically remake reality. One can hardly deny this. What I have in mind is that science actually has such a power. But does this mean that this power of science is a straight path to the ideal or perfection that transhumanists talk so much about? Moreover, is it possible in principle to achieve any ideal or to create any perfection which in the works of transhumanists is marked by the categories of transhuman or posthuman condition, or of such a term like humanity 2.0? I know that transhumanist thinking and the discourse that reflects it are not homogeneous, and by no means all transhumanists argue that one day there will actually be a perfect entity or perfect state of being created. Some transhumanists argue that there is no particular ideal or perfection to speak of, that there exists only the process of perpetual progress. But at the same time, they argue that it is indeed possible to achieve a transhuman or posthuman existence. For example, by making a significant change in some aspects of the human being, like human life expectancy, or by finding ways to help people avoid some of the sufferings of old age, so they can enjoy a fulfilling life for a very long time. But even if so, it is not clear, at least to me, what function the categories of transhuman or posthuman play here, with the exception, of course, of ideological seduction. It is true that from time immemorial, people have been searching for ways of prolonging their lives and making them as easy and painless as possible. And, in fact, people have been and are pretty good at it. Our life expectancy is getting long and long, and indeed our quality of life is becoming likewise. Therefore, are many examples. To be sure, we have much more than Viagra. We have also artificial joints, artificial teeth, insulin pumps, heart stimulators, and other devices that help people avoid all sorts of issues. Let me use my own experience here. I have as many as 4 artificial joints in my body, so-called prostheses, without which, of course, I would suffer physically much more. However, trust in me, I still do not feel like a transhuman, much less a posthuman. Also, in light with suggestions of some researchers' works, I could conceptualize or define myself as a soft cyborg, and therefore not a human being. But, as I said, even though the number of artificial joints in my body has only increased over time, I have continued to feel human, or too human, to put it in Nietzschean terms. Of course, it is not so important to understand my well-being as it is to understand that human existence, and, if to be more precise, the categories of perfection and ideality found within, are intimately related to the development of the most general sense, our knowledge, and at the same time to the possibilities and abilities of conceptualizing our existence. This process is largely determined and managed, as by the way, probably also in the time of Augustine, by educators, or the people who, using the categories of Foucault's philosophy, have knowledge in their disposition and at the same time the power to socially establish this knowledge. In today's world, where science is held the essential form of knowledge, it is the scientists and experts who are the key educators who base their knowledge on cutting-edge scientific discoveries and inventions. They can be seen as holders of knowledge and power. Here is a quite rich tradition of thought, but one only has to look at Foucault's critical works on medicine, psychiatry, the school, and so on. In my opinion, Foucault's revelation of the relationship between knowledge and power opened up the possibility of representing education, or at least humanistically oriented education, which in its turn aims to improve a human through the practical application of certain knowledge. For example, by teaching him and at the same time forcing him to be social, healthy, working as a kind of social structure that is essentially coercive. But Foucault's genealogical works also did something else. It laid the foundations for the development of the historical ontology, a specific method of social reality cognition which was later developed by the philosopher of science Ian Hacking. In their writings, Foucault and Hacking have made it clear that our perception of reality, and thus our perception of ourselves as an integral and inseparable part of reality, is inextricably bound up with historically evolving knowledge. So, it means that we know what reality is, and what we are, and what we as humans are, in a historically limited way. Or, to put it in another words, we answer the question of what reality is and what human is, as well as the question of what a human ought to be, based on the limits of the knowledge and the conceptualization possibilities of reality and of the human. So, we answer all the questions about reality and about human based on the knowledge that exists in a given historically time. This is especially true of the scientific, technological, and expert knowledge that undoubtedly evolves and that transhumanists appeal to as a tool for transcending human limits. And that is why I'm inclined to look to a humanistically or transhumanistically understood educational project, which can be defined as an attempt to improve humans, making them more ideal, to humanize them, as in the case of humanism, or even alter them into a new kind of being that in its turn is free from all human limitations, as in the case of transhumanism. So I'm inclined to look to this project critically. It is precisely that along with the historical change in knowledge, there is a change in the understanding of both human limitations and human ideality. Since I don't have much time to expand on the topic, I will provide a single example. Just one of the physical qualities of a human, body mass. Not so long ago, human bulkiness, in the case we are talking primarily about a male, was seen as a symbol of his powerfulness. However, with the advent of the body mass index and its correlation with various diseases, of course, here I talk about scientific knowledge, bulkiness came to be seen as a symbol of human weakness or their vulnerability. It is no longer said that a bulky man is a strong or powerful man, but that he belongs to a risk group more susceptible to disease. And that is why nowadays we are so intensively educated to be slim and fit, and our smart watches also carry out this education process to remind ourselves not to forget to move. Actually, my watch just did it. Not so smart, if disturbing, yes. But it is for this reason that I argue that it is possible to have not only a social critique of transhumanism, but also a conceptual or logical one. It is by showing that transhumanism, if understood and defined in the most general sense, that is, as an effort, a human effort based on the development of scientific and technological knowledge to overcome the human limitations and to transcend the ontological limits of the human at the same time, approaching from the perspective of historical ontology reveals as internally contradictory. The contradictory nature of transhumanism, both as an ideology and as a project, stems from the fact that the ideal it postulates, in its inner education program, which in its turn most theoretically and practically embodies the impactful educational consciousness of the Enlightenment through the wish to create the perfection, whatever that is, a perfect being or a perfect social condition. So this transhumanist ideal is unrealizable in principle. Historical ontology clearly demonstrates that scientific and technological knowledge and capacities which have changed in the course of historical time make it possible to look at human in an entirely different way, to see him in the new new limitations that need to be eliminated, and at the same time to reveal new horizons of human ideality. So, if you look at the project of transhumanism from the perspective of historical ontology, it becomes clear that no transcendence of the ontological boundaries of the human being is possible, at least in the visions of some of the proponents of transhumanism. As I mentioned, for example, who talks about posthuman condition, humanity 2.0, and so on. The contradictoriness of transhumanist thought it can be said its educational paradigm is rooted in the acknowledgement of the fact of, on the one hand, the perpetual change or progress of scientific and technological knowledge, and on the other hand, the failure to take into consideration the fact that along with such a change, let it be progress, there is a change of ontological limits of the human being. In this sense, the human as an entity, to use Hacking's terms, is a constantly moving target, with no objective, stable, or fixed ontological boundaries beyond which it could be stated that the goal of transhumanism, the creation of a transhuman or posthuman or humanity 2.0, has been achieved. Now, in closing my presentation, I will once again briefly return to the story about Augustine. What is left of that story today, looking at it from the perspective of the history of education criticism? We probably look with horror and condemnation at the fact that this saint was beaten by his teacher, although it was done so that Augustine would be turned into the ideal of a human of that time. But what Augustine was really rebelling against, based on Bertrand's book that I mentioned, one might suspect that Augustine much more disliked that what he was being beaten for than that he was being beaten. It seems that, first of all, he didn't like the process of education and the road paved with it to, let it say, human ideality. But then let me ask you, isn't it the case that all paths to human ideality to pursue only one historically specific ideal are paved with coercion and at the same time denial? I mean, the compulsion to pursue only a historically specific ideal and a denial of what historical ontology clearly shows, namely that ideals are not constant or ossified and perpetually evolve. However, I believe that this is a question that at least can be prolifically raised when discussing both the ideal-based humanistic educational paradigm and the project of transhumanism based on this paradigm, which in turn persistently attempt to convince us how imperfect we are and what perfections we can or even should be molded up into. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marius, for this very thought-provoking lecture. Now to our second lecturer, Maria M. Bulatovic from the Faculty of Philology from the University of Belgrade.
Maria Bulatovic, I have to put this M because there is already another Maria Bulatovic who is actually an educational expert. I'm not. I'm also not an expert on transhumanism, but I'm really interested into that topic and generally into philosophy of art. So my presentation today, which is entitled A Possible Transhumanist Educational Effect, the case of museum metahuman, will actually outline this aesthetic aspect of the transhumanist paradigm. So before I put my main argument on the table, I would just like to briefly put everything into a context in which I'm actually interpreting this this museum, metahuman museum case. We already said something about the technological upgrade of the entire society and human, which has become a kind of framework of rethinking the world, of rethinking the identity, and of rethinking the transcendence of the limits in the context of the perceptive, cognitive, practical, and creative ones. So we are living in a kind of digital informational society nowadays, which actually aims at no more time-consuming activities, the irrelevant designation of place and time, and different force majeure have shown us that actually place and time become quite anonymous. It was no more important where you are and how long you're actually doing something, as long as you're doing it. Therefore, this connectivity agenda has been somehow established within the networking and the dialogic form of society through this digital society paradigm. Transhumanist paradigm is, in my opinion, something which is nesting in this context of the informational society, and has been recently, since maybe since the 80s, when you think about it, widely discussed philosophical movement of technological upgrade and transgressions of the already mentioned limits of the self, which are kind of onto-epistemological limits, as well as these scientific and biotechnological developments, which are always resonating some kind socially, legally, culturally being discussed, morally, and of course, I think artistically. So posthumanism is somehow of course, in my world of interpretation, the umbrella term, but I somehow stick to transhumanism because I think it explains better my view of what transhumanism actually is, of what transhuman actually is. So I will use transhumanism more, strictly related, referring mostly to the notion of transcendence, which I take as a key term of transhumanism. And I will also speak about this meta-human concept as a concept of human artifact, which is kind of artificially created human who is representing our human reflection on the existence, but in a kind of ontic form. And I will explain it, of course, based on the case of the museum meta-human. So to somehow complete this post-human scenario network, meta-humanism is usually referred as a recent approach, which is closely related to Deleuzian legacy, and it emphasizes the body as a locus for amorphic resignification, which is extended in the kinetic relations as body network. Transcendence is definitely the key term which I use in the interpretation, which I define as the capability, which could be interpreted as a quality of the feature of the corporeal existence. Of course, I have to say that in the background is a lot of research on Merleau-Ponty, because he's one of the philosophers my PhD thesis is relying on. Therefore, this transcendence is interpreted in this Merleau-Pontian line, which denotes a feature of the corporeal existence which widens the limits of the self, but actually it never really, the actual existence is never really surpassed. So in line of this interpretation, every human being can be considered as a transhuman. However, meta-human is, in this context, a kind of a product, a kind of embodied self-reflection on the overall existence. So my main argument is that educational practices can be in great extent enriched by the post-humanist technologies through the process of participation and through the process of wondering, of wonder, of marvel in the Aristotelian terms, as the birthplace of philosophical and critical thinking, which is generally nurturing the humanist ideal of education in an altered form, which is through different technological practices. So in these Aristotelian terms, knowledge is the one which brings us pleasure, this highly intellectual cognitive pleasure. So I would say the same one which is recognized as the aesthetic pleasure in poetics. So pleasure is what comes from a learning, recognizing something as something, and this learning and knowledge is something in Aristotelian universe which is considered as mostly desirable. So therefore, I see this kind of aesthetic aspect of the learning path, of the learning technique, which is enabled through pleasure, this cognitive pleasure, which is taken as a kind of aesthetic device. So if wonder is connected to curiosity, to our desire to know, desire which is tackling the mind, and therefore wonder is the root of the philosophical and questioning the self. Therefore, post-humanist, or let's say transhumanist strategies, I think comprise this concept of wonder as they belong to the world. I will also rely on Aristotelian term, the world of probable impossibilities, which again is a syntagm that Aristotle contributed to art and artwork in his theory of fiction, again outlining this aesthetic background and kind of leading towards maybe the idea of aesthetic education. I will elaborate this shortly on a kind of example. I took the example of a national one, let's say so. This was the meta-human in the National Museum of Serbia, which was presented as a global innovation in 2020 at Expo Dubai kind of Congress. And then it was presented to Serbian audience on 4th of March this year, 2022. So as an innovative project of Serbian scientists and of the game industry. Based on the analysis of the excavated bones and remains, a realistic 3D model of the skull of the prehistoric man was first made. And with meta-human technology, which was developed by a local gaming company and Unreal Engine software, the prehistoric man came to life. So this new technology, which is called digital ancient people, was used and the technology combines a range of different methods for the preparation of a scientifically based osteobiography of ancient people. Therefore, after this, let's say, scientific part of reconstruction, what followed was the transfer of the reconstructed face to the digital biokinetic model, which actually simulates facial gesticulation. The face model, there is another interesting part of this, which is technological one, is that the face model, the whole bust, has been exhibited in a display case. And the equipment for digitally revived resident of this archaeological site in Serbia, Lepenski Vir, consisted of a large screen, which is 55-inch screen, a mobile phone, and a computer. So using the phone's front camera, visitors were able to transfer their facial expressions to this big screen. So this was the example of the combination of science and gaming industry, which announced an impact in many other branches of creative industry, and such as primarily in video content, but also in museology, archaeology, and education. So for the mission and the aim, which was advocated by the team, was very interestingly the development and support to a multidisciplinary approach and in innovations in creative industries and so on. So so I go back now to my initial statement and my initial argument that about the participation and wonder as two key aspects of within this post-humanist or transhumanist paradigm, is that participation in this example was very important, as the visitors of the museum were denoted as the part of the scientific and digital revolution, which means that the visitors' feedback was necessary. The meta-human was imitating these gestures that the visitor was actually giving to him, and this is considered as a kind of dialogic, maybe hybrid dialogic form. And within the public sphere, where actually some of the intersubjective aspects may be read, and the aspect of internalizing the other, which might have happened in the reflection of the very visitor, and nurturing this kind of sense of commonness, of mutual reconnaissance, of let's say other aspects which are important of nurturing education in a wide sense, of, let's say, raising social awareness and providing some kind of metacognitive insights. So this, I would say, opposition of the meta-human and the real human has put this position of as-ifness as well on the scene, and implying that the foundation of the education through the post-humanist strategies are profoundly, and also relating to this concept of transcendence, are profoundly humanist, as they address the humanist ideals in the example given. Also through wonder as the amazement which comes from the historical finding of the unknown to be known, which is also seen as this Aristotelian desire to know, and through the technological innovation or gamification of turning impossibilities to probabilities, has led to this perfect human replica, which can imitate us, and also which creates a link to this world of fiction, where pleasure is taken as the key point, key term of the aesthetic background of the overall process. So aesthetic strategy is also seen through this aesthetic representation of the model within also the aesthetic space of the museum. Museum is also considered as a learning environment and kind of heterotopia of time in this Foucauldian terms of other place where actually artifacts exist in time, but at the same time they transcend this time. So the quality of transcendence is as well the quality of the human being. One can transcend himself or herself, reflecting its own existence outside himself or herself, the limits of the self, through this concept of the meta-human. Educational effects, which seem to be very important nowadays for the new models of museum, which are not only this display case, but are aiming to interaction, can be enriched in great extent using these post-humanist technologies through the idea of wonder and through the idea of participation as two crucial aspects related to these strategies. So through wondering, the desire for learning, the desire for knowing is induced, and through participation, through participating, the knowledge, the know-how, and learning strategies are exchanged. Again, within this aesthetic context of the museum, and via aesthetic devices, such as, first of all, the creative representation of the meta-human model, then through the creative process of imitation as an outcome of this interaction, which is again a great space of creativity left on the visitor or the recipient, and of course the pleasure, which is identified as the incentive and the outcome. Therefore, I would kind of conclude my open reflection and this draft presentation that actually educational effects achieved through the post-humanist strategies show the constant transcendence of the limitations of the self, at the same time broadening the very self, and this intersubjective field, which is seen as a field of exchange, but also the field of the interaction of the selves, of different selves, whether this is a meta-human self or a real self. Therefore, in this example of the museum meta-human case, given the post-humanist strategies are given for the sake of the educational goals, aimed at exploring the strategies of the construction of the fictive and, let's say, futuristic worlds and technologies of the self, through the idea of transcendence taken as essentially humanist, which is the deepest quality of the human being per se. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Okay, I have so many notes and questions for the both of you, but first, do we have some questions or comments from the audience? If we do, the mic will be passed on to you.
Just because you talked so much about perfection, I was curious to hear what we can say concerning the content, something specific about perfection. What are the aspects you would draw upon? What would you think? Is there any the most meaningful notion of perfection one could work with in the transhumanist context? If you were first to give an answer concerning the content of this notion. And concerning the question, so you drew upon the notion of the meta-human. Where did you get that? You got that from an exhibition in which took place in Serbia, no? Yes. And maybe you can then expand upon that. Thank you.
So about perfection, I think that such a thing as perfection in our real life do not exist. It exists only in historical knowledge. And that it is the main idea which I tried to emphasize in my presentation. In different historical epochs, there are different conceptions of perfection. And that is why I think that transhumanism is internally contradictory project when he talks about perfection, that it is actually possible to reach. As I mentioned, transhumanism discourse is not homogeneous. I think you are not in that company who is talking now about perfection from the capital P, yes? But there are some names which can be mentioned. For example, Max More, I think, he represents very good this idea that here really exists perfection. In his very well-known article about transhumanism as a future philosophy, he talks about it, that we have to progress from one stage to another and then to reach a perfect state of being, posthuman state. But as I said, I don't believe that perfection actually exists in ordinary life now. Thank you. I think, yes, it makes sense, and actually it is your position, and I do agree with it. But in the different historical epochs, there are different possibilities to have, understanding of what perfection is, and that is what I try to emphasize.
So you were asking me about the notion of the meta-human. It is actually very interesting because when this meta-human model appeared in March 2022, they called it like that, the meta-human of Lepinski Vira, this archaeological site. And it tackled a bit, I was interested in my mind, what is actually meant by that. So apparently there is this meta-human technology which is derived from the gaming industry of creating the models of the perfect human replica, which now maybe we could have seen it on maybe YouTube. There is this animation video which shows the very gestures and all the interesting parts of this facial gesticulation. The thing is, I was researching a little bit on this meta-humanism, and it's very interesting because in this post-human scenario, it is related mostly to the Deleuzian philosophy and so. But it's also interesting that in the 80s, this term meta-human was specifically used in the comic series in DC Comics. So this is pretty cool to say so. And it was mentioned that this meta-humanism should not be confused with meta-humanity, which is a term which appeared in the 80s, which referred to the superheroes and mutants, and since then has been very much exploited and used in cultural studies. So in my concept of meta-human, of course I take into the account the previous these designations of meta-human and meta-humanism, but I consider it as a kind of a product, as a kind of an artifact, which is at the same time a thing, and at the same time has the features of an artwork, because it is a product of human creativity. Thank you for the question. It might be interesting. It can be found on YouTube. It can be found on YouTube. Yes. Metacognitive insights or metacognition in my horizon of interpretation is considered as reflection on the reflection. So when I say it was, and it is related to this meta-human model as a kind of metaphoric, but at the same time visible transposition of this term of metacognition or metacognitive insight, that you are reconsidering something which is already considered. In this case, this is the human existence and the human per se, human itself, and this intrigue, you know, how was the human 10,000 years ago? And this was, of course, this model was based on this osteobiography, this biography of the bones, of course, but as well revived, which gives us even more, even better insight into this meta-human. These 10,000 years don't seem so, you know, distant. So when I refer, you know, at the beginning of my presentation, the time and space have become now anonymous. This anonymous is also considered as not, you don't take time anymore as a calendar, you don't take time anymore physically. Something is really, you know, closer to you than it was. And I think that posthumanist or transhumanist strategies allow this. So this production of meta-human is actually the visible of the invisible. If we take that the invisible is this metacognition as reflection on the reflection, then the meta-human would be kind of personification of this metacognition. But as I said in the beginning, having the ontic form. I hope I was able to clarify it at least.
I kind of don't understand when you say meta-human is a thing for you. Are you referring to the case study here or generally speaking? You said something about meta-human is a product, a thing. So you're referring to the case study or generally speaking?
In this case, I refer to the very example of this meta-human because, I don't know, I don't think I can say it in generally because it widens the field of the research. You know, what could be actually be put under this semantic field of meta-human. This would be really interesting. But in this case, I'm referring to the very meta-human model, which is taken as an artifact, but, you know, a thing which has this aesthetic also aspect.
Yeah, okay, because when you say you're referring to you understand transhumanism and metahumanism differently, I kind of wanted to know more about this. And I don't know, like, I believe that the video will solve many of my questions to see what are you talking about in real life.
This title, Serbia Creates Ideas, was it only as I understood, it was not only for the very meta-human model. This was just a part of this project because this is a national platform Serbia creates. So this was my understanding.
Okay, yeah. I think this is a good time to see the video. Yeah, and we have enough time for the discussion because we only had two presentations here, so we'll have enough time for all of you to ask your questions and to get the discussion going.
I think that I even haven't seen this very video. I've seen some short one, but...
MetaHuman je svoju premijeru imao u decembru mesecu u Dubaju na svetskoj izložbi Expo, gde je izazvao ogromnu pažnju tamošnje i javnosti i medija, kako lokalnih, tako i svih svetskih medija. Mnogo je važan ovaj projekat. Mislim da ćemo stvari njegovu važnost tek da shvatimo. Kada zaživi, kada se prelije u mnoge kreativne industrije, ali i druge oblasti društva i života uopšte. Za samu platformu Srbija stvara je ovo veliki ponos zapravo da smo učestvovali i podržali jedan ovakav projekat, da smo prepoznati od naših najnaprednijih naučnika i tehnoloških inovatora.
Od danas je naš praistorijski čovek u Narodnom muzeju naredna 2 meseca i svi građani Srbije imaće izuzetnu priliku da vide nešto što do sada nikada nije urađeno i što je nakon Dubaja stiglo u Beograd i nadam se da će svi uživati u tome da vide kako je jedan drevni čovek izgledao kada pokazuje svoje emocije i da naravno iskoriste ovu jedinstvenu priliku da budu u interakciji s njim, odnosno da putem telefona upućuju određene emocije, facijalne ekspresije i naš praistorijski čovek će im na isti način uzvratiti.
Mi oživljavamo i našu postavku sad ovde u atrijumu, koju počinjemo upravo sa praistorijskim materijalom, sa lepenskim virom, sa venčanskom kulturom, osvedočenim u celom svetu kao izuzetno važnim i značajnim, ali sada i na najbolji način i potkrepljenim i dokazanim i proverenim kako je uistinu mogao da izgleda taj čovek. On je vrlo blizak nama. Kada ga pogledamo, ne razlikujemo se mnogo od njega.
Ovaj čovek je živao pre 10.000 godina, a onda je dobio jednu ideju, pa je njegov sin dobio sledeću ideju, pa je njegov sin sina dobio drugu ideju, neko je napravio točak, neko veslo, neko čamac. I tako je nastalo sve. Tako se materializovao svet u kome danas živimo pomoću ideja. Trebalo je 10.000 godina da ja nemam bradu, već da stavim kravatu, imam ovde mikrofon, možete da me snimite i tako dalje. I onda kada je ideja ono što ide iz Srbije, i to je suština kompletnog napretka, to širi u ovaj univerzum, onda mi je srce puno.
Platforma Srbija stvara ne podržava samo mlade naučnike, već i mlade umetnike. I mi svi nekako zajedno u udruženim snagama jedino što imamo je ideja. Jedino što imamo smo mi sami i kvalitet i ono što mi nosimo sa sobom. I to je naše obeležje. Mi smo na taj način pravi ambasadori svoje zemlje. Pa ja mogu samo da mu kažem da mi je drago što smo se upoznali. Znam da je dugo čekao na taj trenutak.
Ne možeš ti da shvatiš da je on star 10.000 godina. Sve kontaš da je u pitanju neka maska. Nisi siguran baš da je to taj. Ali posle kad je počeo da imitira moje poglede i to, onda sam već počeo da sumnjam da se radi o nečem ozbiljnom. Vjerovatno bi neka komunikacija između nas dvojice trebala da bude preko zvuka. Ja mislim da je to onaj Beethovenova pa, da bi to mogao odmah da ukapira. I Zensu blues, normalno.
Tako da je to fascinantno videti da to ljudsko biće, videti ili zamišljati barem, je imalo neverovatan isto život, znači ljudi oko njega, ta zajednica, bavio se ribolovom. Taj kapacitet da si pronicljiv u stvari, da osjećaš, da komuniciraš sa drugima bez obzira na jezik, bez obzira na bilo šta drugo, kroz gest ili kroz čisto to energetsko razumevanje, to je bilo tad isto kao i danas.
Thank you, Anna. Before we continue with the questions, Maria, would you like to comment on the video?
Well, just briefly. When I saw this model, I was amazed that it looked extremely realistic. You know, in this, it was museum-like, you know, placed in this display case, but you cannot see it on the video how it is realistically done. So unbelievably, to every hair, to every dot on the face, and it was as if somebody alive was in that. I was amazed by that. And of course, this is interesting through this video revival of his gestures. This creates a bit of more interesting interaction, because, as I said, this interaction, I think it's very important. Not only, you know, visiting museums and seeing the artifacts as something as inanimate objects. So.
I will use the opportunity to ask some questions for Maria. You were talking about how about the quality of the transcendence helps people transcend themselves through the ideas of transhumanism, but and the example you were using is not only a form of the art, but also an artistic form. So my question to you is, isn't that what all art does? Can we say that not just the super technological, new era kind of art that can bring the 10,000 years old model alive to us? Isn't that what all art could or is supposed to do? To help us transcend ourselves, but also showing us our own limitations. Can that be a quality of art itself? Or
yes,
is that something that is only specific to nowadays art? And to also add to this question, how would you say that performance as an art form helped in this? From the 60s, 70s, 80s, like the peak years of performance art, to today having live models where the participation of the audience is mandatory for the art form to work. Can we tie this to performance art?
Thank you very much for interesting questions, very provocative ones. Well, you know, as I'm a literary scholar, I need to defend literature, of course, but this is also my personal and professional opinion that yes, art, what art does for sure is transcending the limits of helping us transcend our own limits as well, and bringing closer the models, or call it whatever, meta-human models or artistic models, where we have constantly the example of this transcendence of the limits of the principle of transcendence and principle of indetermination, which is again, you know, space for further interpretation. I think that actually the experience of the aesthetic form, the aesthetic object, the artwork, is essentially formative principle of the identity of the self, per se, because I think that also, let's say, maybe because in the context of the conference, the education is as taking art and literature and whatever form of art can be considered as a form of educational practice, having in mind that experiencing it molds us, it forms us. When it comes to performance as a form of art, I think that well, I don't know if I can give now a definite and clear answer to this, because it's interesting. I'm honestly not a big fan of performance art, so I'm maybe not the best speaker on it, to elaborate, of course. But let's say that I think that also the development of performance as art has been somehow going parallelly with the new paradigms of aesthetic education and of aesthetic paradigms and of technological development. But this is, of course, something which would be, could be discussed in so many ways. But I'm also amazed by performance. I also tend to, especially this participating part of performance. Quite recently, I visited this Worms exhibition, which was in the Museum of Contemporary Art, and I really liked this concept of the sculptures which need the presence of the recipient, of the visitor. This is something which is, not performances where you're actually a passive recipient, but performance which includes the audience, the spectator, the recipient, and so on. So this might be interpreted in line with this participation thing regarding the transhumanist paradigm and educational practice. Thank you very much for these great questions.
Thank you so much for this elaborate answer. I didn't turn on my mic purposefully because I was wondering if there are any more questions from the audience, because I have so many more questions, just to see should I continue or should I give the word to someone from the audience. So, Marius, well, I'll take it from the end of your lecture. While concluding, you mentioned a word that really caught my ear. That's compulsion. You said something like that. I didn't write the exact words, but from what I have written here, that you were saying that you consider the pursuit for progress and/or perfection from the human beings to be a compulsion. And my question is, do you think this is a natural compulsion that all human beings have? Or can we say that this kind of compulsion is culturally conditioned? Can we say that people have the natural need, but taken the world natural in the most basic way, like the need to pursue progress or to strive to perfection? Or can we say that this kind of compulsion towards perfection is a direct product of the Enlightenment?
Thank you for a question. First of all, I think that human and culture can be separated. human is the product of culture. And when you're asking about progression, I think that, of course, we as humans develop, but there's a big difference between transhumanism and natural development, because some transhumanists argue that, for example, Lesko is talking about it, that parents should use genetic engineering to improve their babies, yes, and it should be done compulsory. If we knew that it will help to have better life, but on the other hand, I want to ask, what does it mean, better life? And I think that this conception of better life or the perfectness is culturally conditioned. And that is why I don't think that we have to think in binaries between, natural and cultural. It's my answer. I don't know. Is it enough or no?
Yes. Thank you. That is the answer to my question. Should I continue with my questions? So I was very happy that you, Maria, mentioned DC Comics, because I was thinking of a way to including this to conversation, because as a huge comic book fan, I was thrilled with the title of this section of the conference, which is Transhuman Multiverse. So in the line with that, my question for the both of you is, would you make a distinction, and if yes, what would the distinction be, between metahuman, transhuman, and superhuman, not to say superheroes? What would be the distinction where, okay, this is an enhancement of an individual to maybe get him or her to the level of the average human being, or maybe somewhere above of the average human being? And where is the distinction, if we can even make a distinction between that and superhuman, or to use the comic book word, superheroes?
As many conferences as I attended about transhumanism, as always, I was always asked that, so tell me, please, Marius, what is transhuman? I'll be honest, I don't know what is human, first of all, and that is why I'm sure that I don't know what is transhuman and what is the posthuman or so on. I think that these terms is conditioned, once again, conditioned historically. And in different historical epochs, these terms can be different, can have different meanings, For example, as I mentioned, man's bulkiness, yes? In one historical epoch, it was comprehended as something very good, like something almost superhuman, If you are bulk, you are superhuman. But nowadays, there is a different understanding of bulkiness, that it is the source of diseases, that it is vulnerability, and so on. So I don't know how to define these terms, and I'm trying to figure out. Thank you.
Thank you for your answer. I'm hoping that this conference helped you a bit to get to the answers you're looking for yourself.
Well, I have to say that I'm on similar trace, line of thinking, because when it comes to especially when it comes to this historical understanding of the terminology of the terms, but also essentially, logically or ontologically. So I would say that it's interesting that post-human, what's post-human for whom? From which perspective we're actually, speaking? Are we today for the for the 10,000 years for the human who lived 10,000 years ago in these areas, are we now, for example, post-human? This is with this technological upgrade and so on. So to me, post-human seems to have a lot of connotations with the historical view on the very concept, as if, post-human, as if this is a kind of end of an era, end of humanity. At the same time, as I elaborated, transhuman is every human, because we're constantly trying to transcend our limits. Although I'm taking this in a very humanist, from the position of the humanist paradigm. Metahuman is kind of a simulacrum of the human, because something which is a shadow of the real model. And at the same time, I think that superhuman, although it has a little bit of this Nietzschean connotation of the Übermensch, but I think that it could have been, this maybe terminologically reflects this upgrade of the human, of having some kind of superpowers. But now when I think about, there are comic book heroes who do not have maybe superpowers, but they're somehow the personification of the true defenders of the society, and a kind of essential, the carriers of the essential truth, which is not seen in real life, which is seen in art, which is seen in literature. So, thanks.
Thank you very much for your answer. I am strongly fighting the urge to turn this into a conversation about comic book heroes. So I see we have some questions from the audience. We'll go to that.
the concrete question.
So the concrete question is, are there natural feedback loops between like practical, you know, like the traditional kind of would we have to have a different type of literature, or are we only looking at certain types of literature, literature that is written with fragmented subjects? Are we looking only at modernism, at postmodernism? Like, what is transhumanist literature? I think Rosie said it was sci-fi. Like, what is this something that works for literary studies, or are we going to have transliterary studies, like something completely different? Like, that's my question.
Thanks a lot. Well, now when you think, I don't know about certain currents, or not very familiar whether there is some strict like post-humanist or transhumanist close reading or interpretation of the work of art. But it certainly, I think it's if you can apply it to. I've done, for example, some research on movies. Interpretation on certain movies, films which are dealing directly with this topic. And when you think about it, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is a top example of post-humanist or meta-humanism or transhumanism, examples in literature.
Subject-oriented, interpretive, exegetical text is like whether there is truth in the text. Like, you understand there's a whole method of working with these objects that is completely, it comes from a monastic tradition. Is this something that will the methodology shift, must it shift in order to meet, the new pressing challenges that we have? Or are we just going to say, well, there's never been human in the work of art? I don't know.
Well, I cannot give a clear answer on the methodology now for sure, but I don't think that there should be. I mean, of course, there is possibility always for introducing new technologies and new methodologies and new way of interpretation of the work of art. But I think that, these are some, for example, in this case of Frankenstein, I don't think that in the context of post-humanist, transhumanist paradigm, the important thing is that this is a monster. Because, I think that more important is that we have this kind of supernatural element in the work of art, which is, when it comes to the history of literature, mostly related to 18th, 19th century literature, this Gothic literature, and I don't know, Edgar Allan Poe and so on. But I think that in this example, I think that you're doing actually, in the interpretation, the same thing, as if there is no I think relevant change in methodology and in understanding and elaborating these terms that are I think we are coming back again to this historical part, what's post-human and from which perspective and so on. But I think that, the true element is this one of Freudian maybe in Heimlich, which is, something we do not know, we cannot determine what it is, and we are about to determine what it is, and in that sense we're broadening our cognitive and epistemological limits of our knowing, of our knowledge. This is, what I can think about it right now.
About transhumanism, there are many scholars who are trying to find its origins, for example, in mythology, and in the literature as well. For example, Kafka's Metamorphosis and so on. I'm not very well. I'm not interested, or how to say, I'm not know very well this field, related with the literature. But if we are talking about scientific field or philosophical field, so starting point to analyze transhumanism, I think, is Enlightenment paradigm and its methodology, how to understand human, like entity which can be cultivated in very different ways, and which can be transformed in perfection, as I mentioned. So the Enlightenment is, in my opinion, and not only in mine, is the starting point of transhumanism.
Transhumanism, and I've had some time now to digest your papers a little bit, and I'm wondering, because you're much more versed in the field, where does this idea of superpower become associated with strength and this need to purge vulnerabilities? I think, like, especially in today's world, I see vulnerability sometimes as a superpower in a way. And so I'm wondering why there's this need to purge vulnerability and seek something more instead of honoring our vulnerabilities as our superhuman capacity.
I think that this idea of superpowers is in the fact that we do not know a lot. And that is why we think that actually exists such things, as super, as perfect, and so on. And when someone asks me, tell me, what do you think who human are, I think that one of the ways to define the human is to accept the idea that human is a being and always will be a being who do not know a lot. And it is the main point, when we start to think about human, to accept the idea that we are limited, that our knowledge is limited. Transhumanists, they are criticized by some scholars that that they believe in an epistemic certainty, that everything can be explained, that everything, all problems can be solved. But I don't know if it is, true.
Well, superhumans or superpowers are there to solve everything. This is a good conclusion. I was thinking that maybe this is because when you mentioned superpower, I immediately thought about comic books and our great moderator, and I think this is more of a question maybe for her, but. I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know what to say on it, honestly. Yeah.
Can I just say something? Because this whole time I'm trying to process everything that you say. To answer your question, first of all, I have to start from somewhere. It's not a matter of a genre. You can make borders and say science fiction, Gothic literature can be for posthumans, transhumans, metahumans. When we already say that every medium, every technological medium can be found everywhere. Even if you say food can be a technological medium, because without food, something outside of our body, something else, we can survive. And this is why I believe in cyborgs and how cyborgs work. But I'm sorry, but I understand transhumanism, posthumanism, and metahumanism is so different from you, and my head is spinning. It's really different.
Which is fine, of course, right?
After reading Huxley, Fukuyama, I can't really say yes to transhumanism, but I can really close the door too. For critical posthumanism, yes, it's more about transhumanism is a blind hope to technological mediums for survival, but I can't close the door. Metahuman, I believe, is a balance between nature, culture, and what I believe is to be consequences of our action. So this is why I ask these questions. And I really look forward to read your paper. Maybe then I can understand better your perspective on these schools of thought. Thank you.
Same. But I would also like to mention that I'm not closing the door, although I don't know how it sounded that I might be, but I'm just rethinking about possible interpretations which might be taken into consideration.
Do we have some more questions from the audience? Okay, I would then give a quick comment on your question about the vulnerability, and I would actually offer two different answers to that. First would be a bit more general than when speaking about transhumans, about transcending the humanness, what we are actually talking about isn't just striving for perfection, for the perfection itself. It's actually shielding ourselves and trying to prevent getting hurt, trying to transcend all of our flaws, all of the things that make us vulnerable, either physically or emotionally. And by striving to perfection, by striving to bettering ourselves as humans, we are actually trying to deflect pain. And the other answer I would suggest that relies more on comic books actually is that speaking about strength, especially when we speak about superheroes, when we speak about canonic comic books, mostly DC and having DC and Marvel on mind, what we take as the strength of humans is actually a pretty masculine image of strength. It's physical strength, someone who doesn't deal with their emotions or is extremely mentally strong and focuses more on the physical. So in diverging from the emotions, diverging from the vulnerability would actually in comics come from that they are like in percentage more superheroes that are male, and that they are mostly written for the male audience. So that's what I have to comment on this. Thank you for the question, and it's really an important topic to discuss, not just in the matter of transhumanism and where we are today, but in the matter of speaking like what it is to be human and what it is that we are trying to transcend, or to, like, what is the meta level of that? What are we trying to achieve? Thank you very much. Do we have some more questions, comments? Okay, then I think we can conclude this session. Thank you all so much. First of all, thank you, Marius and Maria. Once again, a big applause for both of you. Thank you, everyone, for the wonderful questions and the wonderful discussion. We have one more session on the 4th floor that will be in Serbian, and it will start in about 10 minutes. So if you're interested, you can go upstairs and hear from our wonderful colleagues.
Just a brief announcement. We made a reservation at Cafe Telma for some of you who haven't heard. There will be a little social gathering for participants. Unfortunately, we weren't able to financially support the gathering, but still it's an opportunity for us to have informal chats.
Thank you, Anna. So for everyone who will want to have a quick break now, we'll be meeting at Telma at 7:30. Thank you so much.